Hi guys, so welcome to our next lesson on looking at the 1916 Easter Rising. In this lesson we're going to look at the end of the Rising and the reasons why it kind of failed as a military exercise, and then maybe in the next lesson we'll probably look at kind of the successes of it and what it did do well. But today we'll be looking at that military aspect, and we're going to look a little bit at trying to get into the minds of a soldier who maybe was involved in this, so trying to work on our historical empathy as well. So just before we start off today, a quick starter activity. From what we have studied, we named two things that went well for the rebels, so went well for the people involved in the rising, and two things that maybe went badly for them. Okay, so we've definitely focused on what went badly, but we've also mentioned a few things that went well. So just to have a good understanding of the rising as a whole in our minds before we start off on making judgments about it. Can you just come up with two things that went well and two things that maybe didn't go too well? Okay, so pause here and take a few minutes, maybe look back through the work from the last few lessons to find the answers to that. Okay, so things that maybe didn't go well, if we say things went badly first, we definitely have the issue with a huge number of volunteers not turning up due to Owen McNeill's article in the Sunday Independent, so the cancellation of the Rising on the Sunday and having to really quickly reorganize for the Monday. We have the issues around the odd and so many of the weapons not arriving. We have the capture of Roger Casement very early on. Okay, so these are all quite, some of the things that went quite wrong in the planning. In terms of the week itself, we can say that maybe at the time they might have hoped that people would rise to their aid a bit more quickly. It doesn't seem to have happened very much during the rising itself, but it does happen later on. Okay, things that went well for them, however. We talked about the Battle of Mount Street Bridge, where 13 men held off was nearly 2,000 British soldiers, so that was a huge success. There were other military successes around as well. The Four Courts had some quite good successes, and the fact that they managed to hold out, even though it was only for 5 days, but the fact that the small rebel force were able to hold out against the British Army for a full week, for the full 5 days, is significant in itself, and it drew a lot of attention as well. This rising was recognized around the world, and people knew what was happening, and people brought notoriety to the fight for independence, a nationalist movement within Ireland. So a lot of things went maybe didn't go to plan. Maybe things militarily didn't go great, but there were successes, both militarily and otherwise, to do with the rising as well. So just to keep all of that in mind as we go into today's lesson. So our objectives today is to understand the reasons for why it failed, and when I say failed, I'm definitely talking in military terms. Okay, why was it defeated? In terms of what was achieved, there is definite successes within this in the aftermath, and we will look at that maybe a bit more in the next lesson. Okay, but for today, we're looking at that military failure, and we're also going to be creating an account of a soldier involved in the rising, and we're going to spend a bit of time looking at how to bring as much historical detail into that kind of account as we can, and I'm looking also for a bit of creativity from you here in terms of how we go about creating such an account. So, reasons for the failure of the Rising. There's a number of reasons why the Rising failed as a military exercise. So, first of all, we have the superiority of the British Army. Okay, the British Army are far more powerful than the Irish Army would ever be. Looking at just even the population of Britain, it's much stronger. The fact that Britain at this time is still an empire, it's one of the real superpowers of the world. So superiority of the British Army, the availability of arms and weapons. The British Army were able to bring in a gunboat here. The Irish rebels simply don't have these kind of resources. We have the capture of the odd. Now we've already talked about this. So the odd is where they had thousands of weapons coming in, huge amounts of ammunition, and even 10 machine guns. This would have made a huge difference to the rising if these supplies had arrived, but unfortunately they just don't. Okay, they don't actually arrive. The rising is confined largely to Dublin. Okay, The original plans were that the Rising would be more of a nationwide affair. It would still go, the main part would still be in Dublin, but there would have been risings throughout the country, and this would have made it a much bigger problem for the British if they had had to fight on so many fronts. However, it is largely confined to Dublin. Now, there is some small-scale rebel activity outside of Dublin, but really, when we talk about the 1916 Easter Rising, we are mainly looking at Dublin. We have the Irish volunteers were outnumbered. Okay, now this was probably always going to be an issue, but wouldn't have been so much of an issue if it hadn't been for volunteers pulling out on the Sunday morning under the orders of Owen McNeill. Now we know that some volunteers still arrived and still fought. However, they are quickly outnumbered. And we looked at in Tuesday's lesson, I think it was, we mentioned that there was about 1,500 Irish soldiers who Irish rebels who fight in Dublin and who march on the Monday morning. By Tuesday evening, they're outnumbered by nearly 5,000 men. There's a huge, huge amount of British soldiers sent in to deal with this. They did not win the public support, so I mentioned this. They had hoped that the public would rise to their aid very quickly, and the public just don't. They just don't seem to agree with what's going on. They just don't come to help these men. They don't come out with their arms and fight alongside them. So they failed to get that support. Now that does change after the rising. We'll look at that in our next lesson, but it is just important to be aware of that they don't win the support of the public. The poor military tactics is a particularly significant issue here. Now, there are obviously some real successes here in terms of Mount Street Bridge, in terms of a number of important strategic locations being taken, but when they're up against the might of the British Army and very experienced, soldiers and very experienced military, these volunteers just aren't as well prepared as they needed to be, and they're not as strategically thinking as the British would be. So, even having their headquarters in the GPO where it can so easily be attacked by the Elgav troop from the Liffey, that is a questionable tactic. There's lots of questionable tactics within this rising, and it is probably down to the lack of experience, and it's also an issue of Pierce liked kind of poetic imagery within what he did, and so wanted things to go a certain way. So it's just important. Now, none of this is particularly new information, but it is important to just kind of think about and to reflect on the fact that it is a military failure, okay, and there are numerous reasons for that, okay. The main task for today, and this is just quite a quick video because really I want to spend quite a bit of time on this task. So you're going to bring in the information we've just been through and the information from the last few lessons into this task. And basically the task is, so you can see up here on the left hand side, this is where the task is described. So I want you to imagine that you are a rebel soldier involved in the rising and create an account of your experience of the rising. Okay, now this is the main part. You are a rebel soldier, and I want to know about your experience of the rising. That is the main point of what we're trying to get across here. That is what I am looking to know about. Okay. I am, however, saying create an account, and that means that I'm giving it open to you and how you want to approach this. Okay. So you can take any of the following forms. Okay. You can do an interview. So imagine you are the soldier, are being interviewed about the rising. Your account must have the questions that the interviewer is asking, and then must have your answers as the soldier. So the question may be, why did you get involved in the rising? And then you as a soldier will give a few sentence answer. Then you ask the next question, which organization were you involved in, which location were you based in, all of this different type of questions. What do you think what would you ask a soldier who was involved in the rising, and what answers would they give? If you don't like the sounds of doing an interview, you might do a diary entry. So you could write about your involvement. This is going to be both personal and historic, okay? Now remember, we're in history here. I am looking for historic details to be brought up, and I'm going to talk about that in a bit more in a second. But if diary entry is only a diary entry if you have personal aspects to it as well. You might create a monologue of your thoughts and feelings at a given point during the rising. So imagine you are this person who's sitting in the GPO, or you're sitting in Jacob's Biscuit Factory, and they're firing at you, and you're in this moment and you're thinking back about what's going on. Maybe you're thinking about the future, maybe you're thinking about the possibility of success or failure, you're thinking about why you got involved. So you can choose any of those different forms. Now, some of them lend themselves quite easily to writing. So for me, I would say the diary entry probably works quite well as a writing task. Not doesn't have to be a writing task, okay, but that would maybe lend to it. Maybe an interview might lead itself more to a recording or a video. Okay, so it's up to you on how you present this entirely. Okay, and that's why I'm giving you so much time today. This video is only going to be a few more minutes long, so you have the time to think about which of these tasks you want to do. Which format do you want to do it as a written piece? Do you want to do an audio recording? Do you want to create a video about this? Really important, and you'll see it up in the blue at the top there. A PowerPoint is not to be used. Okay, this is not a presentation task, therefore no, before you ask, you cannot use PowerPoints for this. Okay, PowerPoints are presentations like what I'm doing at the moment. I'm presenting information. That's not what I'm asking for here. I'm asking for an interview, a dialogue, a diary entry, or a monologue. Okay, now when you have chosen which one you want to do, remember this is all about getting you showing your historical knowledge and showing the information that you know about the Rising. So in the green here, I have listed a lot of different facts and a lot of details about the history of the Rising that we need to maybe include. So within your piece of work, you need to include at least 5 of these pieces of historic information. So you might include details about the politics of Home Rule. You might include comments about the Home Rule crisis, the bringing of the guns in from Larne and Hoth, and the fact that Ireland nearly ended up in civil war at that stage. You might bring in comments about Ireland's involvement in World War One. What do you think about maybe your fellow volunteers who went off to World War One? Remember, there was the vast majority of volunteers who followed John Redmond off to World War One. You might give details about the different organisations involved in the Rising. So maybe give some details about the volunteers or the IRB or the Irish Citizens Army. You might need to do a little bit of research there. Details about which building you are situated. Okay, so we know all the different buildings. It's all in the book that we looked at the other day. Which building are you in and who is your leader in this location? And make sure you check that. Okay, make sure you get the right location there. I also want to know about some of the other locations though. Okay, show me that you know about a few of the locations and where they are and why the rebels have taken them. You might give some details about the leaders of the Rising, so maybe Padraig Pearse, Thomas Clark, James Connolly, etc. Okay, who would you like to bring up? Who would you want to give information about? You might give some information about the newspaper article which Owen McNeill had printed. So maybe comments on whether, if you're a volunteer, why you didn't listen to that article. Okay, or what your opinions of McNeill giving that article are. You might give information about the Aud and Roger Casement being arrested. You might comment on the numbers of rebels involved. You might comment on the numbers of British forces involved. You might make a mention of the Helga gunboat, and you might make comments on information in the proclamation, and we looked at the proclamation there in our last lesson. So essentially what I'm looking for is you're a soldier, you've been involved in the Rising, or you are still currently involved in the Rising, and you're showing me that you have you as the writer are showing an historic knowledge of what it would have been like to be a soldier in this moment. Okay, so any questions about that, please do let me know, and we'll get back to you by email. Okay, but this is the main task for today, so I do want you to spend a good, significant amount of time really thinking about this. It's a really important task to think about our historic empathy and bring our knowledge of all this together. And if if you do a really good job on this, this is definitely something that we can look back on and we can use for revision at later dates. Okay, so really, really important task here. Okay, so as I said, any questions, just let me know by email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Alright, best of luck. Thanks, guys.